this is the last part of chapter 1 of Man and His Symbols. And the reason that I was focused so much on it over the weekend is these are the last paragraphs that Dr. Jung wrote in his lifetime. And he finished it 10 days before he died. And so on the cover here, we have New York City and Hiroshima. And New York City, Hiroshima. And the significance of this is that he's talking about healing the split. And by the split, he's talking about the fact that we haven't really gotten control of nature because we haven't gotten control of our own nature. And so, as he says here, it remains quite natural for men to quarrel, to struggle for superiority over one another. How then have we conquered nature? And he's using Hiroshima and New York City as examples of that. But I read the last time, and I wanted to read this paragraph again because I thought it was important to what we're trying to do here. And so that is, as any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in face of the present condition of the world. And so as I've been, I've sort of been moved to do this outreach to the world about Dr. Jung's work for quite some time now, and that's how I started to do the website in the first place. And so I did write an article on there called The Shift in Consciousness, and I put that in the Dropbox. I decided my printer can't take it for me to print out 100 pages every week, but if you want to read that, that was a preliminary view that I had, which was based on religion, and I've been struggling with religion all my life. We have to change the way we think about things in the world, obviously, and I know that all of us have gone through these numinous experiences, and so what is the shift that we need? And so what Dr. Jung said in Healing the Split is basically that we have to understand that the split is between the unconscious, the psyche, and the conscious mind. And human beings went through this stage up until, I don't know, the time of Christ or so, when we were instinctual beings, maybe before that, probably 3,000 to 5,000 years before that, probably until the time that history started to be written down. At the time that history started to be written down, it meant that we could contemplate what we were doing in some way as creatures. But then after that, gradually, step by step by step, we've gotten to the point where we think we've controlled nature, and we think we're very rational beings and so on, and we've got nature under control. And I say, by what measure do we think we have nature under control? So the other paragraph, the last paragraph that Dr. Jung wrote, this modern standpoint, the standpoint of being totally rational and everything is rational, is surely one-sided and unjust. He was kvetching in the previous paragraph about Dr. Freud, and he says the ideas of Sigmund Freud confirmed for most people the existing contempt for the psyche. Before him, it had been merely overlooked and neglected, and it has now become a dump for moral refuse. And basically was saying that, Freud said that it was, our wish fantasies and also our bad sexual fantasies, I guess. And so he says it's like nature itself, it's neutral, and it contains both light and dark, beautiful and ugly, good and evil, profound and silly. And so I just thought that was a good thing to meditate on, and it would be worthwhile for you to have it in your hand besides just taking it off the website. If we're going to survive as a species, we're going to have some further transformation in our way of thinking about the world. All of us, not only Americans, but every human being on the planet. Because, in the old days, it used to be just the guy who owned the castle next door that you'd fight with, but nowadays we have the means to destroy the world. James Joyce was kind of irrational in the way he wrote. He was asked at one point why he wrote Finnegan's Wake the way he did so densely. And his answer was to keep critics clucking for 300 years. And his previous book was Ulysses. Have you read Ulysses? And are you familiar with Molly Bloom's soliloquy?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you're not familiar with Molly Bloom's soliloquy, make a note of it, Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and look it up on YouTube, because there are several excellent performances of Molly Bloom's soliloquy by different Irish actresses, especially, and they're just terrific at it. And there's nice visuals that go with it on YouTube, but. Ulysses is a very frustrating book because it doesn't just explain, this, then this, then this, then this, and so you think you're into something logical because it's just stream of consciousness, the way we actually are. And so Dr. Jung was asked to write a critique of it, a psychological critique of it, and he bounced off of it for 3 years, and ultimately he put himself into the mindset of James Joyce. And he knew James Joyce personally because Joyce had come to Dr. Jung about the schizophrenia of his daughter, who actually was a schizophrenic. But he put himself into the mindset, and then he wrote a 25-page critique, which, if you read it, it's in volume 15 of the collected works, which is about art and literature and poetry. And I probably should put that in the Dropbox, which I will, in the collected works. So volume 15, and in that is Dr. Jung's critique of Ulysses. And the amusing thing, there's a couple of amusing things. One, the publishers were sort of afraid to publish it. And they wrote to Joyce and said, well, what do you think about this? And Joyce said, hang it low, which in his vernacular meant make it conspicuous. And it was based on something that one of the Habsburg emperors or somebody had said, where he was criticized for something, and he said, well, hang it low so everybody can read this criticism of me, basically. So Joyce was saying, hang it low, make sure you publish it. And there's a cover letter that Dr. Jung wrote to James Joyce when he completed this critique. And in this cover letter, he says about Molly Bloom's soliloquy, well, maybe the devil's grandmother knew so much about a woman, but I didn't. and so I'll be interested to hear what any of you women think of what James Joyce knew about women when he wrote it. Do you have a thought about it? You no? Okay. Well, I urge you to take a look at it. Okay, so we're this rational world, and everybody, I think, thinks that mathematics is rational. Can anybody define calculus for me? Do you know what calculus is?
I avoided knowing that.
Pardon?
I avoided knowing that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to explain it to.
Approximation, right?
Pardon?
It's an approximation method. You start with coarse rectangles and you reduce the size until you have the sum of all the tiny rectangles. So it's an approximation of an area or.
Oh, well, okay, that it could do that. Yes, it could do that. Calculus is the definition of a point on a curved line in hyperspace. Okay, and if I give you an L-shaped graph, and I say, do you want apples or oranges? And I have a certain number of apples and a certain number of oranges, we could graph where the class would be in terms of how many apples people would exchange for oranges. If I add bananas to that, I can make the graph three-dimensional. And so then we could graph and predict, theoretically, statistically, we could predict how many apples, how many oranges, and how many bunches of bananas we would need. But then if we add grapes, now we can no longer graph it. Okay, if we add grapes, we can no longer graph it because there's a fourth dimension, and we don't have four dimensions to graph, but calculus does that. And so when you hear about algorithms on Wall Street, those are all calculus. Those are all models built on trade-offs between this and that, thrown into an equation that ultimately a computer can crunch down on and predict what the next thing is going to be, whether we're going to have apples tomorrow at the opening of Wall Street or whether it's going to be grapes, or sour grapes. But for all the rationality, it's irrational because because statistics is always based on an average. It's not based on something absolute. But the flaw is that, okay, a chessboard has eight squares in each direction and 32 pieces. 16 pieces on each side. And if you do a permutation about how many possible moves there are on a chessboard, it comes out to a couple billion, I think, is the number of possible moves that you could make on a chessboard. But the problem is that people tend to wiggle a little bit more than chess pieces. Okay, and we have a broader range than the squares on a chessboard. And so that's the irrational part. That's the part that mathematics and the rational can never teach us or never know. Okay, and so when Dr. Jung was talking about the psyche, he's trying to tell us about something that until his death, until the time of his death, we basically were ignoring or downplaying, and we need to think about it a lot. Another way of thinking about it, in this piece, he mentions the microscope. And if a child or a teenager maybe looks at a microscope through a microscope, they will see something, but they will have no clue what it is. They'll say, oh, that's an interesting picture, or oh, I see something moving there. But if a pathologist looks through a microscope, they can tell what kind of disease is there, or what cancer is present, and so the point is that the psyche is also a tool, okay, and it's a tool that you need to be able to understand what the meanings are. And what Dr. Jung taught, one of his fundamental teachings, is all of our thinking is in images. In some sense, we think in images. Now, the image might be, he didn't mean by that necessarily a picture. He meant that, okay, a symphony, you can envision a symphony. I can put myself at NHK concert hall in Ueno, Japan, north of Tokyo, playing, and I can put myself right in the Eroica Symphony because I saw it once there, and I can hear it still, and it's an image of that particular event. But when you think of anything, any piece of music, whether it's heavy metal or classical, that's an image of I don't know, that. And I suppose that most of us would think of a time when we were hearing that or seeing that, or with other people when we were listening to that. And so what Dr. Jung says in this piece is, if you're not used to looking, if you're not trained as a pathologist is to look at through a microscope, if you're not trained in what the images mean, then can't possibly understand what it means.
About symbols and dreams, he concentrates a lot about
Right.
on interpretation, but he really emphasizes that interpretation doesn't have to be a psychologist's game sort of thing. It doesn't have to be an expert at it. It's more important to connect the subconscious to the conscious.
It's more important for the individual
For the individual. So how does the individual do interpretation? I mean, what does the therapist do that helps the individual interpret it correctly, or I know correctly isn't the word, but meaningfully.
Probably the best answer, and Marlena can correct me if I'm wrong, but probably the best answer is to guide you on the fact that you can interpret it. You can, in fact, interpret it, and it has a meaning. It has a meaning to you. And, you know, as we saw a couple of weeks ago when I did the interpretation of my dream, and I read the description about the knee, and that description from the Book of Symbols was very, very complicated. And it was all written by Jungian psychologists, okay, who've actually experienced different people's interpretation of knee over the years. And every page in that book, and it's a big, thick book, has something else, you know, knees and lakes and rain and all kinds of things discussed in there as symbols. And every one of those descriptions was written by Jungian analysts. And yet, in that description of the knee, it didn't even come close to what my dream meant. And so it's a question of learning to trust yourself and ask yourself, you know, what is it that my psyche is trying to tell you? And I think that the fundamental point, one of the fundamental points about Dr. Jung's work is that he's saying the psyche is not a refuse bin, he says that in the second to last paragraph he ever wrote. The psyche is not a refuse bin. The psyche is trying to tell you things that it thinks you need to know, whether it does so in dreams or visions. It does so mostly in dreams because when we go to sleep, we take our conscious mind away and let the psyche do its thing. But a vision comes up when, you know, you're really emotionally engaged. Then a vision might come up. That's like the vision of Mephistopheles popping down in the passenger seat of my automobile. I mean, he was there, okay, and you know, was he physically there? Okay, he wasn't. But is it a psychic fact in my psyche? It definitely was. He definitely was. I remember it that way. I remember it as a manifestation of Mephistopheles, just as I had imagined him when I read Faustus in college. And so, you know, obviously I was extremely upset.
I had seen it before in Hillman, and that's, you gotta stay with the image. You don't wanna interpret it and run away from it. You wanna stay with it, you'll keep coming back to it. Like, I had a dream, my dad rose up out of, this was after he died, he rose up out of wetness, you know, it's like he was just reborn, and oh, that means he's reborn. And then, you know, a few years later, I'm going, no, that means he's reborn through me. You know, whatever was, you know, his whoever, whatever that image meant, it was coming through me at that point.
So it was like a refinement, going from coarse to fine.
Yeah, and I'll think about it again, and I'll go, and I'll see it, hooks in there, you know, in some more subtle ways.
Yeah. Jean Raffa, who is one of the writers on my website, and she's been writing about dreams and her dreams for 33 years that I know of. And she keeps going back to dreams, and she's cataloged something like 4,000 of her own dreams. And she's written 3 terrific books. The first one was A Bridge to Wholeness, and then Dream Theaters of the Soul was her second book. And then her 20-year magnum opus is called Healing the Sacred Divide. And it's really an amazing book. And she privileged me to read it in manuscript form. And so I wrote a review of it, the first review it had. And she actually put it on the desk cover of her book, but it's just a remarkable piece of work and really recommended. Her name is Jean Raffa, R-A-F-F-A.
What is the second one again? Theater?
Dream Theaters of the Soul, I think.
Can I
If you,
ask something about dreams?
Sure.
Just a curiosity, kind of. You know how they have books?
right,
Say, like, look up what your dream meant.
right,
And I think it's kind of interesting, like, you can have a dream, and you get these symbols, you know, and sometimes you're like, what is that? And somehow there's this, like, collective unconscious or something, that these symbols are universal, or somehow
mhm,
that you might have a dream and not know what it is, and it's happened to me where I'll look in the book and go, what's that supposed to mean? And it makes sense
mhm.
with what's happening in my life, and I'm like, but I had to go to the book to look up the symbol to have it reflect what I didn't understand what the dream meant.
Well, if it rings true, I mean, a lot of the work by Jungians is about how you feel about things, and so years ago there was a catalog of various writings, including Clarissa Pinkola Estes and Jean Shinoda Bolen, and in this catalog it was called the Sounds True catalog, and I think there's still a website called Sounds True or something like that. I used to buy a lot of things through that catalog, although I haven't in many years. Um, but, you know, if it sounds true, it may be true, or it may be a suggestion that, you know, you have to really ask yourself, and this is
Well, I
what
think,
what Bill is saying, is that you go back and you work on dreams,
well,
and
this was totally unrelated to, like, seeing your dad. It was, like, in particular, something about books, and
Yeah.
about swimming, and it being dark, and I'm like, what's that have to do with anything? Well, the books represented knowledge, something I knew,
right,
and so it kind of tied together that way. So that's what I'm saying. I went, oh, it's referring to knowing this, and then feeling this way about knowing that. And,
right,
But I had to go to the book to
Right.
the dream book.
The book to me was always like a thesaurus. It's sort of like you're going to look for another word or something that, or some
It
way
tied it
to.
together. So in the back, in my subconscious, I knew what it meant.
right,
But to bring it to consciousness, I had to go to the book.
right.
Which is
Yeah.
Try
Let's say
self,
patience.
try self hypnosis.
It helped me, but it flipped on the light sooner than me just, I probably would have forgotten the dream. I probably would have gone,
Do you ask for a dream?
sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I
Write
try
it
to lucid
down.
dreaming, and if I wake up, I'll say, that was a good one. Wow, you know?
Yeah.
Or to hold on to the symbols, just maybe even one or two symbols
Yeah.
will spark your memory.
I've had a
Just
couple in the last
right.
week that have the same theme with the same people, so I'm trying, and I have not looked it up in the book.
So
Yeah.
your psyche's really trying to get you.
Yeah, it's trying to tell me
those
something about
pieces.
empty houses and going into somebody else's house. Well, they're not home. I didn't work on that one.
Okay.
Anyway, enough of my dreams. I'll let you know next week if
Well,
I
I mean, that's what Jungian therapists do, is they help you with that. But in the end, they're going to point you back to yourself. And even these books, okay, they're useful to a certain degree. But I would only go to one if I was really stuck about something, because I know that almost never do they actually bang on.
Well, there's different ones. And some that say it tells the future, some that talk about the symbolism.
Yeah.
And this was
Right.
like talking about the symbolism. Not.
Well, obviously they're based on something.
Yeah.
This big book of symbols.
Mhm.
A bunch of Jungian analysts sat around for years writing this thing, and they thought it was useful to do that. But in the end, they would all tell you that it's, your psyche may be trying to tell you something else with that, with that symbol. And I think you didn't hear my dream, but
No, I didn't.
okay, well, we won't repeat it. But my psyche was trying to tell me, don't give up a piece of your body if you can help it. And it was based on the fact that I need a new knee.
Jung talks somewhat about fantasy.
Yeah.
as opposed to dreams? Is that like a live dream?
Sure.
Is that like a
I mean,
meditation kind of
yeah, sure.
concept?
Sure.
So are those
I mean, it's what a novelist does
equally
too.
valid or as valid in terms of conceptualizing the subconscious as
Yeah,
a
sure.
dream?
Theoretically, yes. Um, because, if you're trying to, I mean, I think what you're thinking of kind of is active imagination. And, and active imagination is a methodology that Dr. Jung used. He first experienced it with the Red Book, with the visions that he had in the Red Book. And although he didn't let on that was what, only the closest people around Jung even knew that the Red Book existed until 2009. And then Sona Shamdasani, who's a professor of Jung studies at some college in London, persuaded the children of Jung, or the heirs of Jung, to release the Red Book and allow it to be published. And Jung himself said that it was the basis of all his other work. That if he hadn't had those experiences, he wouldn't have known what to write in 20 volumes. So here there were Jungian analysts for 50 years who, got trained at the Jung Institute and so on, and they didn't ever know about it. Or maybe at the Jung Institute they would have mentioned it, but they didn't read it.
So the red books are active imaginations
They're,
for the most part.
yes, they were visioning that he was doing every night, but he wasn't trying to do fantasy like you're talking about. He was having visions. They were coming to him. He was writing them down in the black books, and then he rewrote them into the red book. By calligraphy, by German calligraphy, wrote 200 pages of German calligraphy, restating the visions that he had, which he had taken notes in the black books. And later he described this as active imagination. But at the time he was having these visions, he didn't know what was going on. He thought he might be having a psychotic experience or event, and maybe it was. I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist nor a psychologist, so I couldn't say whether they were psychotic. Certainly he had gone through a very emotional time when he'd been through these whole experiences with Freud and Spielrein, and his whole life was turned upside down by 1913 in that 6-year period. And so then from 1913 to 1918 is the period that all these visions came. And so he had a lot of emotion that was coming up. And but active imagination, what you do is you just, either close your eyes or leave them open, but you just wait until something occurs. You meditate, basically, until something happens, and you're visioning it. And it could be anything. It could be a snake, and for him, it was a snake that came up and talked to him. And then, and the next thing that happened was a guy shows up with wings, and a very wise old man, and he has with him Salome, and Salome is blind. Well, Salome is instinct, and instinct is blind. Okay, the significance of that is we all have within us the 4 million year old man or woman. Okay, and we have both men and women in our long history, right? And so that 4 million year old man, woman, human, doesn't know how we have to live. Okay, doesn't know how our society is created. It's instinct. That's what our archetype is instinct. And so in his visioning, Salome was blind because instinct is blind. Instinct just tells you do something. You know, the birds that are outside here, they don't, sit around tonight and plan where they're going to go feed tomorrow. They just do it when the time comes, right? And they don't think about it. But if there was a society of birds that says, okay, we're going to divide up the territory so that only osprey will feed in this pond and only eagles will feed in this pond, that would be great, because then we wouldn't have the air wars that we have around Annapolis all summer long, and everywhere else. I mean, we watch an osprey nest up in Maine, and the last 2 years the eagles have taken, last year they took out both babies. This year the eagles took out one baby, and the one on the Chesapeake I think it took 2 babies this year. And so, but if they had consciousness, they could divide up the world the way we have as human beings.
Still not working for the human beings.
No.
Well, that's right, and
Sounds like human beings.
that's right, and that's what this image is
That's
about,
not it.
right?